We're going to start, and I'm going to say welcome to everybody for joining us this evening, and welcome to the international launch of Claire Gleitman's new book, Ancient Masculinities in the Drama of Arthur Miller and Beyond. This launch is co-sponsored by the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival and the Park Center for Independent Media in the Roy H. Park School of Communications at Ithaca College. As I'm speaking, you are seeing some slides of playwrights and plays and performances that are discussed in the book, so please enjoy. I am Patricia Zimmerman. I'm the director of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, and with my wonderful colleague, Raza Rumi, the director of the Park Center for Independent Media, we have collaborated to do this launch with Claire Gleitman to celebrate her new book. Let me share just a few logistics for tonight's very special event that I think will be useful. We ask that everybody here kindly rename yourself by adding your location after your name. If you go to the top right hand of your screen to 3 dots, click on that and it will allow you to rename. This is wonderful for our speakers to know who's here and where you are. In order to ask a question of Claire or Sue, we ask that you raise your digital hand, not your real one, and turn on your camera. And our moderator, Sue, will bring you into the conversation. To ensure we can include as many voices and ideas as possible, please try to keep your questions and comments as short as possible. In the end of the evening, please check the chat. The chat will have a lot of information, bios of our speakers, information on the playwrights and the plays, and pull quotes from what our speakers are saying. So, and at the end, we will post a PDF of the chat so that you'll be able to have that as a souvenir. The chat will also include the discount code from Bloomsbury for Anxious Masculinities. So our format for tonight will be a short introduction to the book, and then a conversation between author Claire Gleitman and theater studies scholar Sue Abbotson. Claire is the dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences here at Ithaca College and a professor of literatures of English. And Sue is a professor of English at Rhode Island College and a well-known theater studies scholar. Their longer intros, as well as Chris Holmes, will be posted in the chat. After the Q&A, we ask everybody to hang on to Zoom because we'll move to the more informal part of this event, which will be toasts to Claire Gleitman to celebrate and honor her new book, Anxious Masculinities. It is now my pleasure to introduce my wonderful colleague and great comrade, Chris Holmes, Associate Professor and Chair of Literatures in English at Ithaca College. Take it away, Chris.
What an honor to get to introduce you to this book. There's so much that I could say about Claire Gleitman, the woman, the colleague, the director, my dear friend, but tonight it's Claire's scholarship that brings me to the lectern. Claire's book, Anxious Masculinity in the Drama of Arthur Miller and Beyond, Salesmen, Sluggers, and Big Daddies, begins by confronting the dominant figure of 1950s American drama, the male breadwinner, and his anxiety about displacement from the center of economic and cultural relevance, and tracing its resonances outward to our contemporary moment. Using Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman and its legendary loser, Willie Loman, as a Rosetta Stone for understanding how gender, class, and race have preoccupied American plays in the 20th and 21st century, Claire reads the figure of the unmoored white patriarch as the key to decoding not only how playwrights have reacted to and represented the cultural anxieties of their times, but also how modern drama has returned again and again to Miller's figuration of white desperation and its accompanying rage. As Claire writes it, quote, "This anxiety about displacement, about losing potency, centrality, and privilege in an increasingly heterogeneous America is the story of our times." Rather than treating Miller and his most enduring plays as artifacts of the mid-20th century and its conflicts and concerns, Claire shows Miller's importance as linked to the ways in which our playwrights are in conversation with his work. Her early chapters go straight to Miller's most recognizable plays, unpacking his textured work with gender, what Claire calls the tactics of toxic, anxious masculinity. In the chapters that follow, we see Claire connecting the DNA strands that link Miller to his near contemporaries, Tennessee Williams and Lorraine Hansberry, finding that a gendered, sexist, and ultimately racist value system is often inescapable, and as such preoccupies the great American playwrights of the 20th century. Claire then leads us into a new century and a new generation of Miller's descendants, tracing an unlikely inheritance from Miller to Tony Kushner, Paula Vogel, and Alison Bechdel. It is in her work with these 21st century dramatists that we see some of Claire's most original and groundbreaking thinking. In the final, powerful chapter of the book, Claire examines how Black playwrights are still asking, quote, whether Blacks in America can ever be freed from performing for a simultaneously uncomprehending and appropriating gaze. She reads the work of those playwrights as daring their audiences to feel comfortable, to laugh, or to think themselves so different than Americans of the 20th, 19th, or even 17th centuries. In doing so, Claire asks the most poignant question of the book. Are we able to learn from the ugliness, vulgarity, and violence of our national history, or will we remain unwilling to see the world from another's eyes, to understand that not all dances are danced for our enjoyment? Claire closes her book on a note of hopefulness. Trump's appeal to the anxious masculinity that she traces through American drama failed to win him another term. Nevertheless, she warns that Trump has succeeded in conjuring a powerful collective mythology, and there is little sign that this wounded, anxious, violent genie will return to his bottle anytime soon. We are so lucky to have this book and to have a scholar such as Claire Gleitman who can make theater feel so urgent. And now the author herself, Claire Gleitman.
My goodness, Chris, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I think maybe we can all go home now after that, but we're going to start out, or I'm going to start out by just reading a little bit from the book. I should say thank you before I do that also to Patty Zimmerman and to Raza and to the whole Fluff team for making this possible, and to all of you kind people who've turned up this evening. So this is just a brief snippet from the beginning of the book. It should take about 5 minutes. I just chose the first few pages because I thought they would set up the argument and maybe frame the discussion that we're going to have. It is not obvious that anything quite as sensual as the letter Miller sent to Marilyn Monroe in 1956, shortly before their marriage, ever appears in an Arthur Miller play. In an extended sexual fantasy about their future domestic life together, Miller wrote, "I will come again to the kitchen, pretending you are not there, and discover you again." In the fantasy, Miller describes himself as hungry, as Monroe is imagined to be cooking breakfast. As she cooks, he approaches her, quote, "I will kiss your neck and your back and the sweet cantaloupes of your rump and the backs of your knees, and turn you about and kiss your breasts, and the eggs will burn." Miller's letter captures a complex attitude toward the domestic space and a male's relationship to it that reverberates through his playwriting so powerfully as to leave a lasting mark on the American drama of the ensuing 7 decades. The post-war Cold War period during which Miller wrote his most celebrated plays has been described by many cultural commentators as a period marked by an embattled, deeply fraught masculinity, as American males felt themselves to be, in the words of an editorial printed by the mid-century men's magazine Gem, quote, bullied, browbeaten, and neglected by the female sex, which had bonded together to rob us of our independence, dominating qualities, muscularity, and masculinity. The projection of this generalized anxiety onto the female sex has been attributed to a variety of factors, including the movement of large numbers of women out of the home and into the workplace during the Second World War, and the changes in the nature of male work that began with the Industrial Revolution and was cemented, as it were, throughout the first half of the 20th century. In an increasingly bureaucratized urban work environment, men confronted more competition in the labor force and fewer opportunities for personal advancement. It did not help that the very nature of office work, which relies not on physical strength, but on the ability to do often highly repetitive and refined tasks, made it difficult to avoid the British social critic Anthony Ludovici's emasculating conclusion. Men were engaged in a form of labor that every woman knows she could easily undertake. For the purposes of this study, the most revealing manifestation of these cascading anxieties is the ideology of domestic containment that Elaine Tyler May associates with the post-war period. Domestic containment, May argues, was the homeland's analog to the policies of containment that governed foreign affairs. A similar doctrine provided the infrastructure from which the mythology of the 1950s American dream household grew. With its happily homebound wife and mother, its hardworking and tough-minded father provider, and its cheerful children, all safely contained within their picket fence suburban idyll. That the father knows best version of this mythology is and always was a construction hardly needs to be said. Nevertheless, powerful public policy measures aligned with the swirling fears of otherness in the time period to inculcate the view that the family was a bastion of safety in an insecure world, as long as that family conformed to the prevailing norms of political and personal behavior, which generally meant abiding by rigidly maintained gender roles and being heterosexual married parents who are also white. In reality, large numbers of American men and women experienced profound dissatisfaction within the rigid ideological assumptions that were ballasting the coveted suburban ranch house lifestyle. This darker tale has been told by cultural historians, and it is also a tale that is told by Arthur Miller's mid-century plays. These conflicts have much to do with the Miller male's complex relationship to the domestic space, which brings us again, my last paragraph, to the letter to Monroe with which this chapter began. It is noteworthy that Miller places Monroe famously in the public eye because of her gifts as an actor, as well as her astonishing physical beauty, in the kitchen, where he imagines discovering her again. When he does so, he eroticizes her in strikingly domestic terms, seducing her as she cooks breakfast. Sorry, I lost my place. Seducing her as she cooks breakfast and metaphorizing her body parts as cantaloupes. But the goal of his erotic efforts is to turn her away from her domestic task. As he kisses her breasts, he turns her about. One should be wary, of course, of overreading a private communication that both parties presumably enjoyed. Still, it is difficult not to discern in it the tensions that are laced through Miller's plays and many of the other plays in my book, especially when one bears in mind that he wrote the letter just weeks before their marriage, a union that offered Miller both the promise and the risk of domesticating his exquisite lover, with whom he had been having an extramarital affair. The fantasy appears to be hopeful at first about constant renewal and rediscovery, as it places the erotic and the edible in harmony and forecasts a satisfying mingling of the sensual and the domestic in the couple's married life together. Yet the fantasy concludes with an overdetermined image that is perhaps unconsciously suggestive of the irreconcilable nature of these realms of human experience. In Miller's own drama, not to mention his marriage, The Eggs Will Burn. I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Hi, Sue.
Hi, hello. I was trying to work out which button to press there. It's great to be here. Welcome to this wonderful event, and I'm very excited for this opportunity to interview the author here. And to start off, I just have to say that this really is a wonderful read, which I thoroughly recommend to everybody. It's really so very cleverly structured. That's what struck me when I was reading it. The way leads on to way, and it really is a very powerful book. When I first got my copy, just looking at the contents list, I wasn't even quite sure how we were going to get from Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams to Suzanne Laurie Parks, Jackie Sibbles Drury, and Jeremy Harris's Slave Play, and yet it does so wonderfully. It makes sense once you read it. I mean, we go from the prison house of gender to Strudel and the Single Man, Witchcraft and the Weird, performing white male heteronormativity, playing ball on the margins, queering a new generation, to cakewalks and the white gaze, and it is worth the walk along the way. The mix of playwrights in this book it's so well balanced in terms of stature, in terms of gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. And it's also very clear that you not only understand how drama is written, Claire, but you also understand how it is performed, which really brings to the discussion a lot of life to the discussion, I think. As noted, this exploration of gender dynamics on both a cultural and sexual level, taking in misogyny, homophobia, sexism, racism, all the great isms along the way, and showing how all are intrinsically connected is just so timely, it seems to me. And you make it crystal clear that our current problems are not new problems, but sprang from roots set down over 70 years ago. So I'd like to ask, what got you started on this fascinating topic?
Thank you. Thank you for everything you said and for that question. It was a kind of a roundabout, circuitous path, which I think is basically the story of my life. But I spent the first 15 years or so of my scholarly career focused on something else entirely, the Irish drama and the genre of the modern history play. And then I reached a point where I felt that that work had kind of reached a natural end, and I was sort of casting about for new directions. I took a little break from traditional scholarship and I wrote a play, not a very good one. But it did get a little production in Philadelphia, and I learned a lot from writing it. And as I say, I was just sort of casting about for my next step. At the same time, I was experimenting with some new things in my classes as I was starting to think more about drama, to explore drama more explicitly from a gender-focused lens. So I created a couple of new classes. One was called Taking It Like a Man, which turned out to be very important to the book. Another called Dangerous Women in Dramatic Literature. And in a lot of ways, the book really flowed from those classes and conversations I had with students in them. In the context of those classes, I was thinking more and more about well, what's really at the heart of the book that I think Chris Holmes articulated better than I will, but repeated images that I was noticing of frustrated masculinity in connection to the domestic realm. And what really fascinated me is that I began to think that these characters' quest for a socially acceptable masculinity requires them to perform roles that deprive them of a socially acceptable masculinity. if you follow me. That is, different expectations for successful masculinity are just constantly colliding. So just to quickly finish the trajectory, which is what you asked me about, as I was starting to think about all of this, I presented some papers at conferences. I got some warm encouragement from Miller scholars, including yourself. And for quite a while, I thought that the book was going to focus exclusively on Arthur Miller. And then I happened to find myself at a workshop that was sponsored by Ithaca College's Center for Faculty Excellence. That was, people were presenting their book projects at this workshop. And a colleague of mine in the business school, as he listened to my ideas about anxious masculinity, just in a very off-the-cuff way said, I think my father was an anxious male breadwinner. And hearing that, it was a kind of a revelation. And that off-the-cuff comment made me think that this figure that I had rooted in Arthur Miller and in that time period might have a more extended life.
That's so interesting. I mean, I am very intrigued in a way as to what actually guided your choice of plays beyond Miller. I mean, was there some sort of process here that you went through? How did you follow? How did you stack them up?
My process was probably as haphazard as my life, but an example of that is it was very, very late in the writing process. In fact, I think I'd written the last chapter on Susan Laurie Parks, Jeremy Harris, and Jackie Sibley's jury, and was looking back at the book and thought, why is Tennessee Williams not in this book? That is completely crazy. The first thing anybody who's going to think who reads this is, why is Tennessee Williams not in this book? So I went back and wrote the chapter on Tennessee Williams, which is now the second chapter. But if I were to pretend that it all flowed in a kind of a clear and chronological way, I guess it seems pretty clear that Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams together capture the domestic containment that we associate with the 1940s and 50s. Then I wanted to move on to, if I can remember everybody I write about, I wanted to move on to playwrights just a little bit later. So this would be Lorraine Hansberry, August Wilson, and Sam Shepard, who also, I think, the notion of domestic containment is tremendously important to them, but they're focusing on characters who are profoundly disempowered, so that suburban picket fenced world that Willy Loman can barely afford is really out of reach for them, for reasons having to do with poverty and race. And then the next chapter looks at three playwrights: Kushner, who's in that chapter, Paula Vogel, and Janine Tesori and Lisa Crone. And there I was interested in plays that I read as focused on the children of the anxious male breadwinner and their efforts to free themselves from his clutches and his ways of thinking. And finally, as has been mentioned, the book ends with three very contemporary Black American writers who their plays are very different, but generally speaking, they're asking the question of what this all looks like from the perspective of contemporary Black American experience.
Indeed, I like the way you managed to actually, while you're discussing those three in the final chapter, you show how they really do link back to Miller and to Williams, and it sort of brings the whole argument round, which certainly makes me wonder to maybe think about Chris's question about, are we able to learn from our history? Are we doomed to repeat it to some extent?
Yeah.
Maybe I'd like to ask about, could you maybe say something more about about what guided your decision to intermingle this sort of play analysis with contemporary politics?
Yeah,
I found that really drew me in. I liked it, but how did that evolve?
Thank you. I'll just say quickly, your comment about the last chapter. One of my very discerning first readers, when I submitted the draft, made the point that they weren't really sure. They liked the last chapter, but they weren't really sure what it had to do with the rest of the book. So I had some revising to do and I think one of my strategies was to bring out the theme of anxious whiteness, which I think is an undercurrent in almost every play that I write about, to try to bring that more to the surface in the earlier chapters. But in terms of that intermingling, again, somewhat by accident, but it was the case that, I mean, I guess it became deliberate, but I did the bulk of the writing of the book between about 2017 and 2021. And there were a few other things going on at that time, you know. So as that inescapable barkings of Donald Trump were sort of entering my consciousness, hard though I was working to keep them at bay, what caught my attention were his, I'm of course far from the only person to observe this, but his frequent invocations of what sounded just like 1940s, 1950s domestic containment. And what I mean by that are all of those promises to make America great again by getting your husbands back to work. That was one of his phrases. And by, it sounded very much to me, by restoring a 1950s understanding of gender roles and portraying the white gendered suburban middle-class dream as in need of rescuing from external threats. And another aspect of what Trump seemed so effective in drawing out of some of his most loyal voters is this sense of aggrieved entitlement that Willie Loman and his sons give voice to persistently throughout Death of a Salesman, this sense that they have been cast out somehow, that they've lost the position of centrality that they view as rightfully theirs, and they're absolutely baffled by that. I could also talk about, should I stop or should I keep talking?
Well, I'm kind of interested in the, you know, we've heard a lot of these terms, the anxious masculinity and the anxious whiteness. Could we maybe connect those a little bit? I mean, is maleness intrinsically white?
No, I don't think, well, I guess it depends on how you mean that. I think, now I think I follow you, and I'll say, and I'll change my answer to yes. If what we're talking about is the attainment of successful masculinity in American culture, yeah, I think that that's absolutely essentially linked to whiteness. And I think, and maybe this is precisely what you were thinking when you asked the question, that maybe the best illustration of that, or one strong illustration of that in the book, is Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire, which is a play that I read as a battle between the very suggestively named Blanche, meaning of course white, Dubois, and Stanley Kowalski for the mantle of whiteness. And an aspect of that battle for Stanley, I should mention, is a Polish man enormously anxious about the question of whether he is sufficiently or is regarded as 100% American, a phrase that he uses several times in the play. And the play was written at a moment, of course, in 1947, when many white immigrant groups, not just a Polish, but also Irish, Jewish, Italian, were subject to negative racialized stereotypes, which they sometimes tried to overcome, right, by defining themselves against African Americans and dark-skinned immigrant groups. And I think that this is something you can see played out in A Streetcar Named Desire, where Stanley has to not just destroy Blanche Dubois by essentially declaring and showing that she is not the lily white woman that she claims to be, but a beast. And there's a lot of images of whiteness and blackness in the play, but a bestial whore. And he successfully accomplishes that by raping her and having her consigned to a mental institution at the end of the play. But there is a really amazing scene at the end after he has done that, when he berates his Latino friend Pablo, the only non-white named character in the play, Pablo, who is Stanley's poker buddy. He berates him at the end of the play for not speaking English and instructs that he speak English, which is a really interesting gesture, given that Stanley is essentially a monosyllabic character, and it's Blanche who's the English teacher in the play. So it's a way to claim her place. He also declares himself completely self-reliant and self-made, which is a classic white supremacist claim.
That's so interesting. Obviously, there's also the sexual complications of masculinity, which maybe we could talk a little bit about, but obviously you developed when you bring in Williams, because obviously you have Cat and Hot Tin Roof in there as well. And of course, later, Tony Kushner, Paula Vogel, the Fun Home stuff. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. And so I think I would talk about that by linking together Big Daddy and Cat and Hot Tin Roof, Roy Cohn in Angels in America, who is of course based on the historical Roy Cohn, who happens to have been a father figure, Trump has described him that way, to Donald Trump, and Bruce Bechdel in the musical version of Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, which, as you say, are the plays that I talk about in that chapter. And I think what we see with all of these men is the sort of almost requirement to become complicit with patriarchy and heterosexism in the context of a homophobic society. So Big Daddy, as an example, Big Daddy may well be a queer man. He says to his almost certainly closeted gay son, Brick, at one point, I also knocked around in my time. It's as close as he ever comes to coming out to his son. But he performs a kind of virulent heterosexism, especially misogynistic heterosexuality to the hilt. He tells us that he loathes his wife, but he still, forgive the language, it is Big Daddy's, not mine, lays her regular as a piston. He brags about that in the play. And he fantasizes about having sex with prostitutes who he says he's going to smother with minks and choke with diamonds. In other words, he's clearly full of rage and loathing for women, but he dutifully performs hypermasculinity, and he tells his son that he needs to do the same in order to survive in American society. Roy Cohn and Bruce Bechdel, a similar phenomenon.
And you've got Uncle Peck in there as well, I think.
And you've got Uncle Peck there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they do. They all associate themselves with supremely masculine cliches, in a way, stereotypes, to avoid their own sexuality.
To avoid facing their own sexuality, to avoid revealing their own sexuality. And they pass these notions along to their children as a kind of, even Roy Cohn can be put in this category, because Roy Cohn has a pseudo son in the play. They pass these rigid notions of gender and sexuality along to their children as what they perceive as a kind of gesture of protectiveness and love, because they believe that their children won't be able to survive otherwise unless they take on this same mask.
And the children they're passing this on to are all predominantly homosexual.
Yeah.
Which adds another beautiful level of irony there.
Yeah, all of them are at least likely queer, if not known by us to
Mhm.
be queer in each case.
Mhm.
And some of them are able to reject their father or pseudo father's wisdom, and others aren't. And it
Mhm.
partly has to do with the moment in historical time that they're living in, whether they can or they can't.
Indeed, indeed. Do you see the US currently entering a new era of domestic containment?
Yeah.
I mean, women have
I
taken a few hits lately.
I fear so, right? Not only because of the ongoing adulation for Trump that we know is very live in our country, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which certainly my response to that is that it comes from a motive of domestic containment or controlling women. So I am very worried, as I'm sure many of us are, about the moment we're standing in.
I'm wondering if you feel that this is an intrinsically American story, or has it maybe a more global dimension? I mean, you talk in the book about slavery being America's original sin and how that has impacted. I was just wondering if this might be beyond the scope of what we need to talk about here. It just occurred to me that I mean, as some of you may have noticed from my accent, I'm not quite from America. I'm originally from England, and I'm sort of obviously looking at this and thinking, well, you know, we have a lot of this in England too.
Yeah, yes, and I certainly think we are seeing that this is a global phenomenon for sure. And in slave play, which you reference, the central white male character in that play happens to be a British man. And for some time, the Black woman who is married to him, their marriage is under a lot of strain in the play, wants to see him as the exception to the rule. She says throughout her life she would never have considered dating a white American man, but she thought of this British man as fundamentally different. And she comes around to recognizing for a host of reasons that isn't so.
So it's interesting. Chris's comment about Willy Loman being sort of the Rosetta Stone for how this book spirals out. I was wondering, did exploring this topic actually change the way you think about Miller, who you started off with?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've thought about it a lot. That is, how has my thinking changed? I'm not sure it's fundamentally changed, but I think it has become more complex in a variety of ways. Well, I will say, just pertaining to what we were talking about before, it was something of a revelation to recognize the play's relevance to the moment that we're standing in, which is not to say that I ever thought of Arthur Miller as dated. I don't. I think the plays are as powerful on stage as they always were. But I guess that pre-Trump, I naively imagined that some of the ways of thinking that his characters manifest belong to a different time. So that was a discovery that I made in the process of writing the book. But another thing I think about a lot, and an area where I believe my thinking has somewhat sharpened, has to do with the question of misogyny in Arthur Miller's plays. And I'll say, in my classes, and this has been true for many, many, many years, my students have always asked the question, because of the highly polarized representation of females in Miller's plays, have often asked the question, is Miller a misogynist? And in dealing with that question in class, I will say my answer has always been to encourage them to think about whether the plays are themselves misogynistic. That is, you know, do they uncritically endorse the value system of their characters, or are they about misogyny? That is, are the characters' ways of thinking under critique? And my answer might sound like cheating, but I feel strongly that the answer is both of those things. I think it's very fluid and I think it flips back and forth. And I'll offer as an example, just because it's the easiest in some ways, Miller's All My Sons, which seems to offer a pretty clear binary, as I read it, between men who either are or at least wish they were principled, outward looking, socially responsible, and women who are really, what's the image I'm looking for? Just laser focused, that'll do, on hearth and home. And it would seem at first glance pretty obvious who's under critique here, right? Especially given everything we know about Arthur Miller's profound social and political engagement throughout his life. But it doesn't take that long to see not only that the men are traitors to the values that they espouse, but that they're completely incapable of translating their socially responsible ideas, or let's say their ethical values, into any kind of meaningful action. And I started to think as I was writing the book, I guess, more about how that applies to so many of Arthur Miller's characters, male characters, who, the key ones, at least in the 4 that I talk about in the book, either actually or essentially commit suicide, many suicides in Miller, because they can't imagine any escape from the general amorality except their own self-extinction. Or I think they engage in some kind of evasive action to avoid seeing what the whole play should have made clear to them. So just last thing I'll say is that the women tend to lack the kind of tortured moral conscience of the men, but they're also survivors in ways often
Indeed
the men
they
are
are.
not.
Indeed they are. I think this might be a good chance to open it up for other people to ask a few questions. I see, Rachel, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I'm curious. You've talked a little bit about contemporary playwrights and how you opened up your book in the later chapters. But I'm curious, what playwrights are continuing to expand and explore this concept of anxious masculinity that aren't in the book? Is there anyone that you are sort of reevaluating or thinking, oh, I should have had them in there?
What an absolutely wonderful question. Yes, there are several. I'm really, really interested. It's a little bit broader maybe than anxious masculinity, but I think gender tensions in really fascinating ways. There's a contemporary American playwright named Jen Silverman, who's just coming into view. As Chris Holmes knows, I was trying to bring her to Ithaca College and so far haven't been successful, but one of these days, she's definitely a playwright to watch. Sarah Rule is another one, a really, really fascinating contemporary American playwright. And I just want to say, I'm going to disobey the question and say that Jackie Sibley's Jury and Jeremy Harris are very young playwrights. So I think there's a lot still to come from them. Jeremy Harris wrote Slave Play when he was still at Yale Drama School, which I think he's just out of right now. So yeah, a lot of interesting things going on in the American drama. I'm sure there are others. My mind just went a little blank, but I'll stop with those 2.
That's wonderful.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I just remind you, if you want to ask a question, you need to put your hand up, use the digital hand, because I'm not looking in the chat. So if you have a question, do we have anyone up there? I mean, I would just sort of add that obviously your book here is focusing on Miller's early plays, and I think he does actually do something slightly different in some of the later plays. But we have another question here from Hugh. Hugh?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Yeah, okay. Sorry. Thanks so much.
Sorry, I was nodding.
Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation, both the questions and your answers, Claire. And I wanted to go back to Miller, if I could, just for a second, and ask if you think there are any characters, any male characters, who escape the paradigm that you define in the book. And I know that some critics that one Miller, I think it's Biff who gets away from the family at the end, and then the next door neighbor Bernard, for instance, offers sort of a different vision of masculinity than the kind of classic toxic masculinity. But I've read your book and I know you have some pushback on that. And so I wonder if you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think at least in the 4 plays that I talk about in the book, it is hard to find an example of genuine escape from a toxic masculinity. But you've asked specifically about Biff and Bernard. Biff certainly, as you'll all remember, I bet many of you have read Death of a Salesman, rejects his father's hopeless dream very emphatically, and comes to a kind of a recognition at the end of the play. I think the recognition is a problematic one. The recognition is, he says, everything I want is out there. I'm misquoting slightly. Everything I want is out there as long as I say I know who I am. I got that a little wrong, but it's close enough. And I think that assumption is in and of itself very problematic. And I think Biff acts out how problematic it is, in the sense that he, at the end of the play, goes back to the West, where he was his most happy. And that's nice. But it is a kind of a retrograde and anti-historical action on his part. And I talk a lot about this line in the book. The play knows that, even if Biff doesn't, because Biff, this one I'll get right. Early in the play, Biff says to his brother that men like us don't belong in this nut house of a city. We should be mixing cement on some open plain. Well,
it's making me think of how Miller portrays what it's like out on the open plains and the misfits.
Exactly. Exactly.
So even Miller knows Biff's dream is crazy.
Yeah. And as for Bernard, Bernard is the next door neighbor who Happy and Biff endlessly make fun of as insufficiently masculine and anemic and all of the other nasty terms they use to describe him. And I had a student once, because Bernard does very well in the play, who said the play's subtitle should be Revenge of the Nerd. Bernard does very, very well, but I think it's important to notice that Bernard is successful, as I read him, pretty much precisely in Willy Loman's terms, as Willy Loman defines success. He has 2 sons. He gets to travel. He travels from his home to Washington, D.C., where he practices as a lawyer. He's clearly wealthy. He hobnobs with people who play tennis, and he has a wife, but she doesn't get named. The importance of her is her existence, not her humanity. So he's a perfect kind of crystallization, I think, of Willy Loman's notion of masculine success. It looks like he's happy, so that's nice, but I don't see him as an escape from standard notions of masculine success, which I think is what you were asking me, Hugh.
Thank you. Chris, you have a question.
I do. I think many people on the webinar will know you as a fantastic director, Claire, but you have spent a life directing these plays and many, many others. And I'm wondering what that vantage has given. I mean, Sue already noted that you really taken into account the ways that production changes these plays, but I wonder how your role specifically as a director has influenced your writing.
I think that having directed, and I'll throw in also having written a bad play, has enriched my understanding of dramatic form enormously. One thing that you are really acutely aware of when you direct, which you have to be aware of when you read a play, but it's challenging, is to think about physical bodies on the stage and where they move and what's happening when they're not speaking is essential to the movement of the play. That all of these physical choices that a director is making are hopefully, if the director is good, are crucially helping to bring to visual life the meaning of the play. I had the opportunity to, I mean, when Chris says that I direct, what I've directed over the years are staged readings, not full productions, which is an interesting form in itself, I think. But I had the opportunity to direct All My Sons 3 times, I think, with 3 different casts, and watching what those people do, what those different human beings did with the roles, the different ways they incarnate them. I mean, I have to say that as someone who has much to say about Miller's female characters that is sometimes critical, nevertheless, the strength that comes across in Linda Lohman or Kate Keller when performed by a fine actor, a female actor, enriches your sense of these characters. So yeah, so it's really stretched my thinking, and I'll just say again, help me to think about where are those bodies, what are those silences doing?
That's yeah, I remember seeing, I actually was able to attend one of those readings that you did. I think you did one at an Arthur Miller conference.
I did.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to what was some of the actual sort of challenges in conceptualizing and writing this book, because you've got a lot of eggs in this basket. Is that something you could maybe say something about? Was it too big a question?
There was a long period of time when I was really convinced that I would never finish it. This is, I'm sure, not true of all writers of books, but it took me a long time. I mean, I'm 61 years old. This is my first published book, monograph. And it percolated over what I would say is about a decade. I wrote for a while. I wrote the chapters about the Arthur Miller plays and thought, I don't know how to contain this. I will never be able to write the introduction. It's just impossible. I don't know what I'm writing about. I can do isolated close readings, but what's the hanger? What's bringing them together? What is the argument of the book? And it just took a long time. I will say that when my sabbatical was postponed as a result of COVID, that was actually and I was expecting to use that sabbatical to finish the book. And instead the sabbatical was postponed by a year. And that turned out in some ways to be a really good thing, because during this, I like to say I kind of rage wrote during the summer. I became really determined. But well, yeah, I don't know. There were a lot of challenges. It was hard.
I was kind of fascinated to learn that Tennessee Williams was such a late addition, because he seems to just smoothly flow on there and provide that beautiful, the step by step, and it just fits right in there. But we have another question here, Philip.
Hi, it's extraordinary to talk about casting and using his characters. And I can't help think about a friend of mine who was a gay black man who was cast as the Keller son who believes his father at the Hangar Theater, of all places, in Ithaca. Tommy was fantastic in it, and it blew my mind completely to read the play in terms of this gay black man as one of the Keller sons. It was extraordinary. And I'm just wondering if this whole way of reading Arthur Miller could be extraordinarily exploded by the casting of all these people.
Yes, 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 100% yes. And what I've been thinking about in connection to that is the already acclaimed production. One of the images at the beginning was taken from this production, already acclaimed production of Death of a Salesman, that premiered in London, and it is, I think it's already in previews on Broadway. It's going to open soon, with the great actor, Black American actor, Wendell Pierce. How would people?
It has already opened, yeah. The preview
From the-
it's already there, yeah.
It's already open? Well, I think
Yeah.
it's still in previews.
It's in previews, yes.
Yeah. From The Wire, you may know him. And so in this production, the entire Lohman family is cast with Black actors. And I haven't seen it yet. I have tickets. I'm very excited. But what I've read about it is that they do the production and they change practically nothing. There's just couple of tiny things that they change. As one example, Charlie, the kindly neighbor next door, who always wants to help Willie, at one point refers to him as boy, and that's added to the script. And another change is that when Willie, in the heartbreaking scene with his boss Howard, who's about to fire him, Willie touches Howard, who's white, cast as a white man, to appeal to him, and Howard shrinks from his touch. Otherwise, almost otherwise, some of you may have seen it and can correct me. It is essentially the same script. And what I think is that if Willie's sense of entitlement sometimes frustrates us when we think of him as a white man, to think of him instead as a Black man who is just absolutely bewildered because he believes in a world of infinite promise. That is going to break our heart, I think, in a very different way.
And directors are going to have their revenge. It's true.
Yeah, I saw a production with Charles S. Dutton playing Willie Lohman back a few years back at Yale Rep, and he really did break your heart, because you could it put another level on it for sure. I think we should at this point maybe go to some final comments. Do you have some last words you would like to say, Claire, before I wind this up?
I guess my last words are just thank you to all of you who are here, and for listening, and for the kind words that have been said. And Sue, especially thank you to you. You were an early reader of the play, and you've been enormous. It's not a play, it's a book of the book, and you've been enormously supportive and helpful, and I'm very grateful to you.
Great book. In fact, well, I'll use my last minute to maybe just hype it up a little bit more. I mean, frankly, this book does appeal beyond just drama studies. It offers an excellent detailed analysis of the plays under study, but it speaks obviously to gender and women's studies, queer studies, American studies. It's also simply a good read with very lively, engaging prose, some beautiful flashes of levity, and wonderful depth. So I think by connecting that post-war World War II American containment to current polarizing gender politics and the Trumpism, the book really does offer historical insight and current social commentary to illustrate, how the American dream continuously investigates and critiques the society for which it was written. So it's an excellent study all around of drama, gender, race, and America itself. Go buy it.
Thank you, Sue.
And from Fleff and the producers, I would like to invite everyone now to give a toast to Claire and to Sue and to this wonderful book. Please turn your cameras on so that Sue can see all these great people who have been here with us all this time, and say congratulations to Claire. Thank you.
And we invite everybody who would like to stay. We'll have a little 10-minute informal after party with more toasts. So we'll, and if you come to the after party, we kindly ask you to have your cameras on. So we'll give it a minute for people to get here.
Buy the book and take your PDF. It's now in the chat, I believe, that we've put it there. It's called the chat log. Take it with you. It's got lots of great info that went by, and it's a souvenir. And buy the book.
Can I just say I'm seeing former students of mine from years ago, and I am just so happy to see you and so moved by your presence. Hi, Anthony. Hi, Ross.
And right now we have about 10 minutes or so for a very informal after party. And it's not a book until there's a toast. And so we're going to do a toast. There are a few people here who have copies of the book. And while I do this toast, I'd like to kindly ask you to put it up as a prop so that people know it's a real book. So on behalf of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival and the Park Center for Independent Media and our entire back-end producing team, we would like everybody to raise a glass or a hand or a smile to congratulate our wonderful colleague, Claire Gleitman, on the publication of this really important and significant intervention into how we think about masculinity, how we think about drama, how we think about the post-war period, how we think about domestic containment, the anxious male breadwinner, aggrieved entitlement. And I realize this is quite an epic book because you start with World War II and end kind of in the present. So it's really it's around a 70-year intellectual and theatrical history of masculinity. And I'd like to also say, we really have to salute our colleague Claire for persevering for over a decade to produce a book that has generated such dynamic and lively and important discussion during these incredibly difficult times as we all deal with anxious masculinity, both in the United States and in the globe. So Claire, brava. Brava, everybody raise the hand and glass. And now in fluff and PCIM style, if anyone else would like to offer a toast or say a few words, just raise your digital hand and Annie will get you, will call on you. Ross, I believe you had your hand up, didn't you, at one point?
I did. Hello.
Hi, Ross.
Hi, Claire. How are you?
From my class Sexual Warfare years and years ago. And I'm proud to say that Ross and his now wife met in my class, Sexual Warfare.
So what I was going to chime in and say was, without giving the year, I was a freshman in a freshman seminar that my father had signed me up for because he thought it would be funny. And it was sexual warfare and drama. As an 18-year-old coming into undergrad, I was the last class that I wanted to be in. And when I walked in, I was one of two men in the class, the other being like a 300-pound linebacker on the football team. And so day one, Claire, it was a long class, like a 2.5-hour, 3-hour class. And day one, we had to interview the person sitting next to us, which was my now wife. And Patty, it's good to see you too. I felt like in that first year I had a class with Patty and a class with Claire, and they both were warring for me to, like, one was film and one was English. And now I teach screenwriting and screenwriter and novelist. So Claire, I just want to commend you. I know how hard it is to finish something, anything that's long form. And I have many questions that I'm not going to ask now for you. But I just want to congratulate you. It's a huge feat. And I feel like I got like a zero draft outline of what you ultimately published, because about 80% of the things that you were talking about and reading and sharing with us were things that were introduced to me and are fingerprints now on me in the classroom, and things that I call back to all the time. So I just thank you for the gift to the world of this book, and thank you personally for guiding me to what I do now. I appreciate it.
Ross, thank you. Thank you so much. So much. That just brought tears to my eyes. And congratulations to you and Kate on your two beautiful children.
And hello, Ross.
And Ellen has a thought.
My sister.
Another Gleitman, yes.
Probably the person that has known my sister the longest. As a matter of fact, I would be quite confident of that in this Zoom. I just want to say, Claire, how incredibly proud I am of you, and just to say that Mom and Dad are or would have been just so incredibly happy to have been here and to have read your book. You know, you working through this also through so much personal things that you and I both know you went through during this time, and continuing to persevere. Well, I just wanted to say how much I love you and how proud I am of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ellen.
Anyone else have a something to say, or Stu?
Oh, well, I mean, obviously, Claire, you're the person of the hour, but I do also have to say, Patty and Annie, you've done a great job managing all of this. Thank you so much for the opportunity to interview one of my favorite authors.
Yes, thank you. Patty knows what a nervous wreck I have been anticipating this, and has been very, very, very soothing and encouraging.
Well, the stage fright was invisible. So Anthony from
Hi,
Seattle.
Claire. I just wanted to say hello. I felt like I had to chime in. I saw this come over, this invitation in my email today, and cleared my schedule to make time for it. I'm so happy for you and so glad that I was able to attend this launch. You know, Claire, I don't need to tell you this, obviously, but Claire, you inspired me to write a thesis my senior year at Ithaca College about a very similar topic to this, and so cannot wait to read the book. I can't wait to see, you know, what a real scholar can do with that idea. So I can't be more excited to read it, and so happy for you.
Anthony, it's so wonderful to see you, and I will send you the book, and when I do, you'll see that there's an acknowledgement to you in the book.
Oh.
Because as you say, that independent study that we did together was really the very first, a really important early seed in my thinking.
Oh, well, that makes me feel really special, Claire. But like I said, I just wanted to make sure I could be here, and I'm so happy I got to listen.
So glad you are. Thank you.
I think he was the furthest away, at least that we can tell. Just 3 time zones away. Well, everyone, thanks for sticking around. This is great. Wow, you know, nice to see you all. Sorry we're not all in a real room together, but we're kind of on screen together. That's good. Anyone else have another thought? Because I think we'll wrap it up pretty soon. I mean, it's dinner time.
But
Jennifer.
even if, oh,
I'll just very briefly speak up on behalf of so many of your colleagues here, Claire, and say just kudos to you. You're such a wonderful model of somebody who can be such a phenomenal teacher, doing so much service for the campus, so much work for the campus community, and doing wonderful scholarship. It's wonderful to see, and I just congratulate you wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm just completely overcome. You're all so incredibly kind to say these things, and thank you everybody so much for being here.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and everyone, Chris Holmes for that wonderful introduction, and Claire for writing the book, of course, and Sue for your help with the Q&A, and everyone who asked a question. And I think just if the back end crew could stay on and the guests just for another moment, we'll just have a little debrief and let everyone else get to dinner. So thanks.
Thank you for coming, everybody.